It's good to be with you. And yes, I've done research on all sorts of fruit trees. In fact, one of my favourite fruit trees is the mango. And in fact, it's significant to me as a horticulturist that the first thing mentioned in the Bible that God created were fruit trees. Isn't that significant? First thing must be the most important. Not necessarily, but I'd like to think so. But of course people were last, so I guess they're most important because they're made in the image of God. But the Bible says that God made fruit trees first, and he made fruit trees producing fruit with seed in them after their kind. Now this states one of the most established principles of biology that everybody from a child upwards understands. And that is, when you take a mango seed or an orange seed or something, when you plant it, you get a mango tree or an orange tree. You never get a cabbage plant from planting a mango seed. And the same thing applies to other creatures in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 1 it says God created different things after their kind. They are to reproduce after their kind. In other words, chimpanzees give birth to chimpanzees, humans give birth to humans. No one has ever seen a chimpanzee give birth to something other than a chimpanzee. I mean, if one of the ladies here went to hospital to have a baby and lo and behold you gave birth to a chimpanzee, what would people think? No, it wouldn't happen, would it? But of course the evolutionists say, oh no, but it doesn't happen suddenly like that. It happens over long periods of time. Given enough time, anything is possible is the idea. And so this time becomes the hero of the plot. But in fact, time doesn't make the impossible possible. And we could demonstrate that. So the evolutionary idea is that, well, the first life just made itself in a warm pond on Earth, or there's various theories, but it just popped into existence. And then it changed into all the living things on Earth. In fact, one of the early things to form were worms, which are still around. And these worms ultimately changed into us. In fact, here it is a New Scientist, Simon Conway Morris, a paleontologist. Once we were worms. Does that make you feel significant? Once we were worms. And so this evolutionary idea is a great tree of life idea, that there was originally some chance origin of life, and it changed into all the living things on Earth, including you and me and duckweed in the pond. But in fact, this idea is that death of the unfit and survival of the fittest over eons of time have created all the living things on Earth. And so in fact it's not a tree of life, it's actually a tree of death. It's a tree of death and suffering. And this is one of the reasons why this idea of eons of time and hundreds of millions of years of fossils doesn't stack up with the Bible, because God said when he finished creating everything, it was very good. And this is not very good. In fact, we rebel against it. In fact, one of the greatest excuses for not believing in God is look at all the death and suffering in the world. What sort of God would do that? And of course, the biblical answer is God didn't do it that way. It became that way because of sin. But this evolutionary idea is that everything is related through common ancestry. And so if you trace our ancestry back, you find a common ancestor with the apes, and then you find common ancestors with other animals. And ultimately, they're saying that, for example, elephants and mice had a common ancestor. You know, you trace the elephants and mice, their ancestors, back far enough, you'll find a creature which has given rise to both. And of course, one of the popular evolutionary stories these days is about how whales came to be. You know, animals, sea creatures decided to go onto the land, and they became land animals, and then for some reason or other some of them decided to go back into the sea and become whales and dolphins and things. And so that's how we have whales in the sea, you see. And so this idea of, say, cows and whales are supposed to be closely related. And but there's a fundamental problem with this story of evolution, and this is something that Darwin didn't know, and in fact it's something that really only has really been highlighted in the last 10 years, and every day it's highlighted more. And that is the problem of the origin of information in living things. If you're going to create something complex, to make something complex, you need specifications for it. For example, if you're going to make a motor vehicle or a building like this, you have plans and specifications. Well, living things are far more complex than anything mankind has ever made. And where are their instructions, their specifications? They're written on their DNA. And you all know what DNA stands for, of course, the National Dyslexic Association. No, of course not. But it's the stuff of inheritance, isn't it? And so our genes reside on our DNA, not the ones we wear, but the ones that determine our hair colour and, in fact, whether you keep your hair when you get old and stuff like that. So these are the genes that specify how you to make your body and everything, your physical characteristics, how to make enzymes to digest your food. It's all on your DNA. How much information are we talking about to specify these things? This is one of the wonderful achievements of modern science, is the decoding of the information on the DNA in bacteria and humans, and now thousands of organisms have been decoded. And it's a phenomenal achievement. How much information in a so-called simple bacterium? Well, we're talking about one book of 500 pages of complex coded information. Now, there's no such thing as simple life. Even the simplest bacterium is still being studied to be understood fully. In fact, it's beyond the ability of one scientist to hold in his head or her head detail about anything more than just a tiny part of that bacterium. I'm talking about detail. You can have the overall picture of how it works, but to actually understand in detail how a particular enzyme works or a particular protein transport system or something works, it's mind-bogglingly complex. And so there's no such thing as simple life, and this thing can reproduce itself. When we can make a sophisticated machine, like a jumbo jet or something, that can sit there and reproduce itself in 20 minutes, we're starting to approach the capacity of a simple living thing. And we're far off doing that. Well, just assume that could just pop into existence, which it couldn't, but just for the sake of the argument, assume it could. The evolutionist has to explain how we get horses from microbes and humans. But of course, you're talking about a lot more information because we have features that bacteria and microbes don't have. If you're going to change microbes into microbiologists, how much information do you have to add? We're talking about 1,000 books of information on our DNA. And so do the math. You have to add 999 books of information to change a microbe into mankind. How do you do that? Well, they say that mutations do it. But when we talk about information, what are we talking about? Just a little illustration here. The first line there, she has an automobile. Has 21 letters, including the spaces. And the specificity or meaning is, well, there is meaning there, isn't there? She has an automobile. What sort of automobile? And what's her name? And what colour is it? And how many cylinders does it have? And I notice over here people like to have as many cylinders as possible. Your fuel is cheaper than ours. We're more interested in getting ones that cost less to run. But what about the second sentence there? Well, it's not a sentence, isn't it? It's a random assortment of the same letters. But what does it have any meaning? Does it have any... No, it has no meaning, so it has no specificity. It has no information content. What about the third sentence? She has a red Porsche. Or Sue has a red Porsche. That contains more information than the first sentence, doesn't it? She has an automobile. We know the name of the person now, and we know that it's a Porsche, and we know it's red. So the automobile's a red Porsche. So we have a lot more information, but the same number of letters. Now, the lesson in this is that evolutionists will come along at school and university and tell you that mutations create information because they can add some letters to the DNA. But adding letters doesn't create information. The letters have to be meaningful. In fact, adding letters can mess up the information. These are called mutations. And these mutations mess up things. In fact, two things are held up as being the mechanism for evolution for changing microbes into mankind. And they are mutations and natural selection. What are mutations? Well, they're copying mistakes. See, where do you get your information from in your DNA? You got it from your parents, and they got it from their parents, all the way back to the first parents. If you believe your Bible like I do, that's Adam and Eve. But God created Adam and Eve with all the information necessary to create all the people on earth today, with a few mutations added. I'll mention those in a minute. But these mutations, they're copying mistakes. So when you get your letters copied from your mum and your dad, a mistake can be made, and so instead of a C, it's a T, for example, in your DNA. Now these are random. They just happen by chance, so to speak, and you wouldn't expect that they would actually add meaningful information to your DNA to give you some brand new feature you didn't have before that helped you to do something like increasing your intelligence or something. In fact, Carl Sagan was a well-known atheist here in the United States. He's no longer an atheist because he died. But Carl Sagan admitted this. He said, mutations occur at random and are almost uniformly harmful. It is rare that a precision machine is improved by a random change in the instructions for making it. So the hero of the plot for evolution is mutations, but what do? They mess things up. In fact, they're known by the diseases they cause. We have over 1,000 human diseases caused by mutations. Things like, you've heard of some of these, haemophilia, sickle cell anemia, hemochromatosis, cystic fibrosis. You know, cystic fibrosis is caused by one letter error on the DNA in a particular spot. Dreadful disease. So these mutations cause disease. They wreck us. They mess up the information. They don't create it. That's the problem. In fact, people think, well, what about antibiotic resistance? You know, antibiotic resistance can be due to mutations, and that's evolution in action, they claim. Well, here's an example of what happens with mutations and antibiotic resistance. This is a bacterial cell, and the little factory-like thing there is representing the mechanism inside the cell, the machinery inside the cell for making an enzyme which happens to inactivate the antibiotic, which is in the skull and crossbones up there in the red. And so what happens with this is when you expose the bacterial cell, like a staphylococcus or something, to the antibiotic, normally there's a small amount of this enzyme produced, but the amount of antibiotic overwhelms it, and so it kills the cell. But then we can get a mutation which actually gives it resistance. I'll show you in a minute. So this is what happens with the susceptible cell. So we have some of the enzyme being produced, and the enzyme doesn't last forever, so it has to be renewed to keep the supply up. But you see the amount of antibiotic coming into the cell overwhelms the cell and it kills it. And so it ends up effective. So you've killed the staphylococcus and you're healthy again. Now, what happens with the antibiotic resistance is this. There's a mistake or a mutation in the control system for the factory. So the machinery that makes the enzyme has a mistake in it, which means it loses control over the production of the enzyme. So instead of producing a tiny amount of the enzyme it normally needs, now it's producing stacks of the enzyme, and it can break down all the antibiotic, and it's resistant. It's like this. See, the factory is running flat chat. By the way, that means flat out, as fast as possible. But notice that it sort of had smoke coming out the factory, but living things actually don't produce pollution when they create things. Only we do that when we try to make things in factories. But you see here there's plenty of the enzyme being produced now to overwhelm the antibiotic and to inactivate it all. And we have a resistant type. So here we have a resistance due to mutation, which is a mistake or an error in the control system for the factory that produces the enzyme. But what happens if the antibiotic is not present? You've got no control over the production of the enzyme, so it's producing all this enzyme it doesn't need. So what happens is this microbe is no longer, it's actually defective, but because it's defective, it's antibiotic resistant. So you get the picture? So this is actually pretty typical of what mutations do where they do help organisms. Sometimes mutations are helpful, But again and again and again we find they're still destroying things. They're breaking things. They're not creating things. In fact, Richard Dawkins was asked about this. He's world-famous atheist and evolutionist, and wrote the book The Greatest Show on Earth, supposedly proving evolution once and for all, which my colleague Dr. Jonathan Sarfati has written a brilliant rebuttal to. But Professor Dawkins was asked...
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
There wasn't much sound, so... And he claims that he was framed for this and all sorts of things. But over 1 million people have seen that clip on YouTube. And a documentary, which is called Frog to a Prince, actually has the question, him being asked, and the answer he gives. And he doesn't answer the question. And then later on he wrote in a Skeptics magazine that he was framed and all this sort of stuff, which is rubbish, because we've got the original soundtrack of the whole thing while it was recorded. And he goes on in 8 pages claiming he answers the question, and he doesn't answer the question. It's just more obfuscation, because he didn't have any examples of mutations creating this information. And so this is the fundamental problem. This is the sort of thing that mutations do. They actually wreck things, but sometimes they're useful. Now, this is an example here. This is a normal budgerigar. Anybody got budgerigars? Their favourite, popular bird for keeping. But anyway, there's a mutant budgerigar which is called the feather duster budgerigar because it looks like a feather duster. Its feathers are all messed up. Now, it might be good for cleaning your furniture, but it's not going to fly very well, is it? The poor thing. So this is in Creation magazine. Now, that's what mutations can do. They can mess up existing information, and sometimes it's useful to do that, like in the antibiotic resistance in the bacteria, but it's messing it up. Now, what evolution needs is not messing up existing information, like messing up feathers on birds. Evolution needs mutations to put feathers on reptiles, not wreck them on birds. You get the picture? And that's what mutations are doing. They're wrecking things. There's an example of a beetle blown onto a windy island, and the beetles which could fly kept getting blown into the sea. The beetles that couldn't fly, some were born with mutations that resulted in them not being able to fly, and they had an advantage over the ones that could fly, because the ones that could fly kept getting blown into the sea, the ones that couldn't fly didn't get blown into the sea, and so the ones that couldn't fly had an advantage. So you see how a mutation can be advantageous? Because the ones that kept getting blown into the sea, natural selection gets rid of them, and the ones that didn't get blown into the sea could reproduce, and so on. And so they could survive. And so mutations can be beneficial, but they are still loss of information. That's the point. So that's the fundamental problem. So there's something else. Mutations have to create information which today, what we know, is absolutely mind-boggling complex. It's not just a letter here and there. But if you're going to add something useful, often it requires thousands and thousands of letters in the right position. So not just a little bit of a tweak here and there, but a huge. In fact, if you think about what's going on inside living cells, it's absolutely incredible. Now, protein synthesis. Now, you have proteins like skin and hair and enzymes to digest your dinner tonight and so on. And these are created from information written on the DNA. And the proteins, here's a little primer here, a little tutorial on this so you'll understand the next animation I'm going to show you. Proteins are made up of tens of thousands, up to tens of thousands of amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids. But up to tens of thousands of them together in the right order, the order specified on the DNA, generates the right proteins. And so this is how it happens. The letter sequence on the DNA is actually used by the cell to create the proteins with the right amino acids in the right order. And so this is RNA polymerase produces a chemical called RNA, which is similar to DNA, but its purpose is to be used as a template to actually make proteins. So the right sequence of the DNA for a particular protein is read, transcribed into messenger RNA by RNA polymerase, and then 3 letters at a time on the RNA, see what the yellow is, 3 letters at a time are read to give each amino acid. There's 4 different letters possible, and 3 at a time. Do the math, you've got 64 different possibilities. And this is done by a thing called transfer RNA, which there are more than 20 of them, 1 for each amino acid and more, in a machine called a ribosome. Now, buckle up your seatbelts because the next bit is mind-blowing, if you're not already mind-blown. This is an animation of protein synthesis inside a cell, and this is what happens, and hopefully you can stay with me as we go through. So, firstly, we see one of the letters on the DNA, one of the letters. So this is up close and personal to one of the letters. That's what it looks like sort of as a chemical. We zoom out, this is what it looks like further out, and we come up to the DNA. This is a DNA double helix strand, so we're coming in. And in the background you'll see a machine zip along, that's the RNA polymerase, which actually transcribes the DNA to RNA with the similar letters lined up, the complementary letters, to complement the information sequence on the DNA. So here inside the RNA polymerase, the letters are lining up against their complementary letter on the DNA to generate the complementary sequence on the messenger RNA, which is going to be used to produce the protein. So they're zipping along, creating the messenger RNA, which just comes off there. Now that goes to another machine called a ribosome. And here's transfer RNA, which attaches to each amino acid. There's at least 1 for each amino acid. And this transfer RNA has 3 letters on the other end, which line up with the 3 letters on the messenger RNA inside the ribosome, with a lot of other complex stuff going on and energy compounds coming in to drive the thing. And so we have the protein, which is red, being generated up the top there, with each amino acid being added in the right sequence determined by the letter sequence on the DNA originally. And so there it is. And as it comes out, there are things called chaperones, which attach to it to stop it folding, because it has to fold into a 3-dimensional shape to actually be useful. And there it is coming out. It's all being held, stopped from folding, because it's being fed into another machine called a chaperone-in. And the chaperone-in is actually a folding machine. So the protein's actually fed into the chaperone-in, and inside the chaperone-in, by a process that nobody's got any idea how it happens, it folds the protein. And in about a second flat, the protein's folded, and the chaperone-in opens up to allow the folded protein to come out complete and ready to do its job, like digest your food or something like that. Isn't that mind-boggling? And all that just made itself. That's what they tell us. That's what our kids in university, at college and university and school are being told, that these things just made themselves in a warm pond on earth. All that is necessary for life. Every living thing has that. First living thing had to have it. There's no life without this. The whole process is necessary. Belief in evolution is anti-intellectual. It's anti-science. It's anti-God. It's anti-reason. And it angers me no end that our education system is ramming it down the throats of our kids. The other thing that's supposed to create the information is natural selection, and it's pretty clear to understand, pretty easy to understand why it doesn't work. It doesn't actually add information. Just give you an illustration. Variation and natural selection. Here's a couple of friendly-looking wolves, bears if you like. It might be more appropriate around here. Perhaps I should have coloured them black. I'm told the bears around here are fairly tame. That's just as well because my wife wants to get up close and personal with one. She's a vet, you see, and she loves animals, but I don't think she's... Anyway, she's going to try her charm on a black bear. I'm trying to discourage her, but, you know. Here's a couple of friendly-looking wolves or bears, and the red things look like firecrackers represent genes that determine hair length. And the one with all the hair coming out of it, that says grow long hair. The other one says grow short hair. Now, they don't look like that, of course. Remember, they're a letter sequence on the DNA. But this is just to represent them so you can... This is high school biology. You've all done this. If you've been to high school, you've done this sort of thing. It's pretty simple stuff. So in reproduction, of course, I've got about 25,000 pairs of genes, but just one pair, for example, determining hair length. And so if we choose in the reproduction process, you can get a short-haired gene with a long-haired gene, can't you? Or you can get a short-haired gene with a short-haired gene. So if we get a short-haired gene with a short-haired gene, we end up with a short-hair wolf, unlike mum and dad, which are medium-length hair because they've got a gene which says make short hair and a gene which says make long hair, so they're sort of they're in between. If you're a geneticist, there's a codominant genes. If you're not a geneticist, I didn't say anything. So if you take a short-haired gene with a long-haired gene, you get one just like mum and dad. If you get two long-haired genes together, what do you get? You get a long-haired wolf. Right. So, after the flood, there's an ice age. After the biblical flood, there's an ice age. And which wolves are best adapted to cold conditions? It's no trick question. It's pretty simple. The long-haired ones. Okay, good. Go to the top of the class. Okay, so the long-haired ones. So the short hair and the medium-length hair ones get killed off. This is natural selection. Natural selection kills things that aren't fit to survive. That's what it's about. Death of the unfit. Right? So we end up with a long-haired wolf, which is now adapted to surviving cold conditions. And when they reproduce, what sort of offspring can they have? Can they have only long-haired wolves, can't they? Because they've lost the gene for short hair. So we get lots of long-haired wolves which are adapted to cold conditions. Now, this is natural selection in action, and this happens in today's world. But folks, that is not evolution. That is not changing microbes into mankind. It's not changing wolves into eagles or anything like that. It's just getting rid of ones that don't have the right genes. It doesn't create anything. Only mutations theoretically can create anything. As we've seen, they destroy stuff. Random changes destroy things. Sometimes they're beneficial, but they're still destroying things. And so this is a fundamental problem. So evolution doesn't have a mechanism. Mutations and natural selection do not create the information required. They do not create the complex coded information to make evolution believable. In fact, in Australia there's a professor of geology, Professor Ian Plimer, and he lobbied the government some years ago to stop us from getting into the schools. He said, you cannot allow these creationists to get into the schools. If they have even half an hour with the students, they'll never be able to think straight again. Now, you've just had the half an hour, and you'll never be able to think straight again. Because, folks, if you learnt evolution at school and it didn't make sense, you know why it didn't make sense? Because it doesn't make sense. Changing microbes into mankind just by natural processes doesn't add up. And the more we know about living things, the more it doesn't add up. Nothing adds up for this evolutionary story. It's a very clever story, don't get me wrong. Our universities, our colleges teach it in such a way as to bamboozle the students into thinking it's real. But it's smoke and mirrors. It really is smoke and mirrors. What about dogs? I mean, you look at varieties of dogs and they claim that dogs prove evolution. In fact, Darwin said that. Breeding of dogs proves evolution. The British Museum of Natural History has a display on dogs, how dogs demonstrate evolution. And by the way, those people that represent their dogs, or the dogs, which way is it? The dogs the dogs like their owners, or the owners like the dogs, Actually, it could be intelligent design, because people have actually selected dogs with cute features because they look human-like. That's probably quite likely. That's why we have so many dogs that do look like people, because people have bred them that way. But have a look at these couple of dogs, Chihuahua and a Great Dane. Huge size range in dogs, huge range in features. What about this dog? How would you like to look like that? There's all sorts of varieties of dogs, and you can breed dogs and breed dogs and breed dogs. What do you get? Is that evolution? No, they're still dogs. All sorts of varieties of dogs. And you know that a lot of the varieties we see in our dogs are due to mutations. You know, a dog with short stumpy legs, a dog with pushed in face, a dog that can't shed hair, a poodle. That's a mutation. Because normally dogs have to shed their hair to renew their hair each year for the seasonal variations and so on. But a mutation results in a dog that can't shed its hair, and that's great for having inside because it doesn't shed hair every year like a Labrador or a Retriever or something will, or a German Shepherd. But the poodle's great for having inside, but it's a mutant. It's a mutant dog, as are many of the features of our mutant mutts. And you find within each kind of organism, variety. You find varieties of humans, varieties of horses, varieties of dogs, varieties of ferns, varieties of all sorts of varieties within the kind, but you don't find them changing one thing into the other, which evolution needs. See, variation is not evolution. In fact, this fellow, how would you like a name like this? George Gabor Miklos. He's a scientist and an evolutionist. And he said, we can go on examining natural variation at all levels, as well as hypothesising about speciation events in bedbugs, bears and brachiopods until the planet reaches oblivion, but we still only end up with bedbugs, brachiopods and bears. None of these body plans will transform into rotifers, roundworms or rhynchoceles. You might say, whatever they are. See, you can do mutations and natural selection and all that sort of stuff as much as you like. It's not going to change one basic kind of organism into something else. But evolutionists commonly use a trick to convince people that evolution is real. And this trick goes like this. I see evolution happening in my lab. It's a fact, says the professor at university. And what's the student think when he hears that? Student thinks this sort of evolution, microbes to mankind. What you observe in the lab, I have no problem with. But it doesn't extrapolate to microbes to man evolution. And this is called equivocation. Equivocation. It's changing the definition of a word in mid-sentence. So they define evolution as change, things change, so therefore evolution is a fact. What they mean by evolution, the second definition, is change from microbes to mankind and everything else in between. It's a trick used in debating, a very deceitful trick. So, what are the created kinds when God created? Well, Genesis chapter 1 gives us a bit of an opening or an indication of that, but we might define them something like this. The created kind, people have co-opted the word baramin, which comes from Hebrew bara, create, min, kind, created kind. And Frank Marsh, who was a creationist biologist, said, two species that will hybridise to produce at least an embryo of the same created kind, or baramin. In other words, they belong to the same created kind that God created. If we think about horses, for example, we think about the family equity. You've got zebras, donkeys, horses, and there's a degree of mating where you get offspring. Very rarely the mule is fertile, mostly it's not. There are Z-donks, zebra-donkey hybrids, and horse-zebra hybrids, and some of them are fertile, some are not, but this clearly indicates that these belong to the one created kind that God created in the beginning. And you've got Przewalski's horse, which is a different species also, and these hybridise. And so we think they're the same, belong to the same created kind. And so you have the situation where this variation within a created kind, if you've got the original created kinds, and then since they were created, you've got this diversification into some varieties or species within the created kind. Now, that must have happened to quite an extent after the flood, when Noah took these representatives on the ark, and today we have wolves that are adapted to sort of Arctic conditions, and wolves that are adapted to tropical conditions, and so this would have happened, this diversification happened after the flood through natural selection. It's a part of the creationist biological paradigm. In fact, natural selection was thought of by a creationist before Darwin. But the creationists saw it as a conservative thing, not as a creative thing of changing one kind of thing into another, which it is. It's a conservative thing. It conserves the fit to survive. So you have the evolutionary tree idea that everything goes back to a common ancestor. You have a false view that evolutionists portray in college and university, which is, oh, these creationists are stupid because they believe that God created everything that we see today just as it is today. Nobody says that. We are not the same as Adam. We have degenerated because we're a product of the fall. And so the real creationary orchard idea is what we're talking about. There are species within the created kind and so on. So I don't like it when people say that there are no new species. Some creationists say that sort of thing. No such thing as a new species. Well, sorry, but there are new species. But they're not new created kinds. That's the point. In fact, where is the created kind? Well, because there's a classification system, isn't there? And you've got kingdom, phylum, class, order, and so on. Where is the created kind? Well, it varies depending on the organism. For example, in us, people, we're looking at Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, or human. So you can say at the level of genus, if you take those classifications. Because Homo erectus is a humankind, and not an ape man at all. And but other things, it could be like birds. Some of the birds, it could be at the level of order, and the plants, at the level of some of the plants, at the level of family. So it's not, the classification system today doesn't represent the biblical created kinds. It hasn't been done for that purpose. But back when Linnaeus actually invented the classification system, his purpose was in fact to find the created kinds. And he initially thought the species were the created kinds, and then later on realised that it was broader than that there are multiple species within some of the created kinds and so on. And so this helps us to understand where God created things, and we have diversification within the created kinds. Now, what about the family tree idea that everything's related back? And we've heard about this, about how that there should be all these fossils demonstrating that one thing has changed into the other if this has happened over eons of time, over hundreds of millions of years. And in fact, those fossils are not there. In fact, Dr. Colin Patterson was at the British Museum of Natural History in London, and someone wrote a book, and in that book they asked him about the fact that he'd written a book where he had written a book about evolution, but he had no examples of transitional fossils, something becoming something else in the fossil record, one basic kind of thing changing into something else. And Dr. Patterson said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. And he goes on to say, yet Gould and the American Museum people, this is Stephen J. Gould at the American Museum, he's another atheist that's passed on, are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line, there is not one such fossil which one could make a watertight argument. And if you go to the Chicago, there's a Smithsonian, go to the Smithsonian, and you'll see a diagram there about dinosaur evolution. I'll talk more about dinosaurs on Saturday. And you have this family tree of dinosaurs. There it is, proof positive of evolution. What's a good question we should ask about that as scientists? What do scientists look for? Evidence? Evidence? Well, where's the evidence for this? Well, there's plenty of evidence for the tips of the branches. The creatures on the tips of the branches, there's heaps of evidence for it. And there's stacks of fossil evidence, either partial or complete fossils. That's how many there are in the world's museums. This is in a book out on the book tables, actually, called Evolution, the Grand Experiment. And Dr. Carl Werner, really good book. And he did this research, scouring the world's museums for all the fossils. And this is how many fossils there are. But how many fossils are there demonstrating the family tree? Do you think? half a dozen, hundreds, thousands. There should be thousands of them. There should be thousands and thousands of them if evolution is true. There are none. There are none. Here's an evolutionary textbook, illustrates it. The red bars are actual fossil evidence. See there? The fossil evidence is the red bars. This is the family tree of dinosaurs. The clear parts are imagination. Staggering, isn't it? See, we get told all the time there's always evidence for evolution. It's not. This is not there. The fossil evidence is not there. Oh, they hold up a few in the universities and colleges. There's some proof, Archaeopteryx and so on. None of them stack up. There's a handful, but they should be millions of them. There should be millions of them. They're not there. They're not there. In fact, Stephen Gould said this: the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches. Actually, not even at the nodes, at the tips of the branches. The rest is inference. In other words, imagination, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. He goes on to say, we fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, yet to preserve our favourite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study. Profound, isn't it? The evidence is not there for this. And here's another problem. When we look at the fossils, we find things living today which are just the same as we find in the fossil record, which is supposed to be hundreds of millions of years old. The coelacanth is a well-known one. They call it stasis, and you've heard about this. I mean, they use a technical word when they have a problem with evolution. They call it stasis, which makes it sound scientific, but it's a problem. Because how can these things stay the same while everything else evolves? And in fact, this is the Cambrian Sea, and this is supposed to be 500 million years old or so. And look at the creatures. Do you recognise any of them? Of course you do. Things like jellyfish and starfish and brachiopods and all sorts of sea urchins and things, which are still in the sea today. How come 500 million years of evolution leaves them alone, but changes a worm into us? Problem. So they give it a word which makes it sound like it's part of their story, and they call it stasis. A fancy word. What about the similarity idea? This is one of the prime arguments for evolution. Look at the similarities in living things. That proves they had a common ancestor. That's the major argument for evolution. And of course, that only works if you rule out the possibility of there being not a common ancestor, but a common creator. And this diagram illustrates the point. Why do these two cars have so many things in common other than the yellow colour? Because they had the same designer. They had a horizontally opposed 4-cylinder flat boxer motor driving the rear wheels, independent rear suspension. They had the trunk in the front instead of the back, and etc., etc. So many similarities because they had the same designer, Dr. Porsche. Well, I believe God has placed patterns in living things to counteract the idea of saying they had a common ancestor, but rather saying they had a common designer. For example, this pattern in the limbs that we see, frogs and humans have a very similar limb pattern. But when it comes to the way our feet and our hands develop, it's quite different. In the frog, little buds form to form the toes and they grow outwards, but with a human, a plate forms and the material between the toes and fingers dissolves. A very different mechanism for arriving at a similar pattern. Now, if it was due to evolution, it would be the same mechanism to arrive at the same pattern. But these are the sorts of things that I believe our Creator has placed there to thwart the evolutionary story. See, another thing is this. You find incredible similarities between things that can't be due to common ancestry. These creatures, the mako shark and the bluefin tuna, for example, have tendons which are connected to very strong red muscles to actually drive their tail, and that's why they can swim so fast. Unrelated, evolutionary, they can't be explained, but they have a very sophisticated system for driving their tails. Very similar. And what do the evolutionists do here? They give it another fancy name called convergence. And convergence is when you get the same thing, but not through this common ancestry. So they've got to sort of say, well, you get a marsupial mouse and a placental mouse, and they look almost identical. It's just a fluke. They happen to get that because they developed in the same environment. And there's so many examples of this. I mean, this is the body patterns of an ichthyosaur, a killer whale, and a shark, and so on. And all these, incredible similarities. They call it convergence. Makes it sound like it's part of their story. But it's just a way of putting a label on it to, in fact, deal with a problem. Scott Todd at Kansas State University said this. Now, this touches on why is it that these scientists accept evolution in spite of the evidence. In spite of the evidence. It's like this. Scott Todd said, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. In other words, he has decided, along with many of these others, there is no creator, there is no spiritual realm, so God is ruled out by definition. It's like this, C.S. Lewis said many years ago of this whole enterprise. He said, does the whole vast structure of modern naturalism depend not on positive evidence, but simply on an a priori metaphysical prejudice? Was it devised not to get in facts, but to keep out God? It was devised to keep out God. Evolution at its core is an anti-God philosophy designed to get rid of God. It's not about science, it's about God. So our government authorities say you can't teach religion in schools, therefore you can't have creation. Folks, they're teaching a religion, evolution. It's a religion. It's not science at all. In fact, it's a historical matter, not subject to experiment, so it's not science at all. No more science than creation. So, is this opposed to God? Absolutely. What should we do about it? 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. What are we doing about this evolutionary doctrine? We should be demolishing it, tearing it down, because it stands against God. It stands against the very idea there is a creator. It stands against the idea that God created us. It stands against the idea that God made us in his image. It stands against the idea that God made a good world which became corrupted through sin. It stands against the roots of the gospel. It stands against everything that the Bible stands for. And it's an anti-God philosophy.